Good afternoon, Anthony. Looking forward to discussing the intriguing topic of marsupial moles in Australia with you and where they occur and possibly figure out why.
Yes, well, marsupial moles deserve to be well known as one of the most remarkable life forms in Australia, possibly even more remarkable than the renowned platypus. The platypus seems to be more remarkable because it's a kind of a chimera, a sort of stitch up, of a duck-like bill and somewhat amphibious body parts and paddle tail and so on. That's why it's so well known, is because it doesn't make any sense. It lays eggs, it's amphibious, and it looks a bit like a mixture between a bird and a mammal. But in its own way, the marsupial mole, or more precisely the two species of the genus Notorictus, are even more extraordinary, and they make even less sense ecologically and biogeographically than the platypus does. And so if you were to ask me to name the Australian mammals that are perhaps the most peculiar, the most intriguing, and the most poorly understood, I would probably go for marsupial moles.
That's quite a claim. The platypus is beyond strange. So yeah, look forward to hearing why, how you substantiate that.
Well, you see, a platypus is strange, but there's nothing that strange about an invertebrate eating, rather aquatic mammal. Well, put it this way, the platypus has a niche that perhaps is taken more by birds on other continents, but there's going to be some kind of endothermic creature about that size that eats freshwater invertebrates. So the niche of the animal is well within plausibility, although its body form is certainly startling. But you see, when it comes to marsupial moles, everything about them is so puzzling that one doesn't know where to begin. And in order to understand that puzzle, one first has to get rid of the notion that the marsupial moles are nothing but the Australian convergent counterparts of moles on other continents. There's this pervasive and partly valid idea that certain animals in Australia are the best thing that the marsupial clade could come up with in answer to widespread forms on other continents. So you can kind of shoehorn kangaroos into being the counterparts of gazelles. It doesn't really work, but it gives you at least a foundation for approaching the comparison. But when it comes to marsupial moles and you look at them in detail, there's virtually nothing similar between them and any other mole, including their habitat, because marsupial moles are restricted to a certain north-south band of extremely poor soil in West Central Australia. And in that kind of environment on other continents, whether you're talking about Southern Africa or South America in particular, similar latitudes in the Southern Hemisphere, there's nothing even vaguely like not just a marsupial mole, but a mole at all. There are moles on those land masses, but they don't go into those kinds of environments. And then when you look at the detailed morphological characteristics of marsupial moles, you start to see everything you look at starts to look very different from any other mole.
So what in particular is differentiates them from the golden mole, for example, that I have in my garden within a few meters of me?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is the pouch. And I suppose you could say, well, that's not that surprising because pouches are common to many marsupials. And so you can put that down to accidents of history, or shall we say a sort of phylogenetic conservatism. Yeah. But when you go past the pouch, then the other things about the animal that could easily have been modified by adaptive pressures, by natural selection, have not been modified in a way that results in a particular resemblance with golden moles. Golden moles have different claws from marsupial moles, in particular digit number 4 on the manus, on the forefoot, is the most clawed in marsupial moles, whereas digits 2 and 3 are the ones that are emphasized in golden moles. And there's a difference in size because the biggest digit in the marsupial moles is far more impressive. So a common theme in all these comparative aspects is that marsupial moles are more moly. They're more like the quintessential or epitome of moles than any other moles on Earth. And that extends to all sorts of things. For example, they've got a big broad pad on their nose, which they obviously use to displace Earth. And no other mole on Earth has that kind of horny, bare pad, at least of such a large size. They're completely blind, and they're also apparently completely deaf. Whereas golden moles not only can hear, but they apparently have disproportionately large internal ear bones. These are the South African golden moles.
Yeah.
There's nothing particular about the vestigial tail of a golden mole, whereas the tail of a marsupial mole is distinctly peculiar, quite distinct, quite long, and with a sort of knob at the end. And the cervical, the neck vertebrae of a marsupial mole are all fused, indicating some kind of rigidity, perhaps in association with the use of a combination of the tail and the nose. So that's part of the anatomical profile. But then when you look at the way they dig, it's quite different too, because marsupial moles are the only moles in the world that basically dig every inch of their travel underground throughout their lives. They never reuse the same tunnel system. What happens with golden moles is either they have a kind of a tunnel system that results in them pushing up mole hills, which means that they're displacing Earth in order to create some kind of passage underground that they can potentially return along. Because why else would you produce a molehill? You're trying to create a kind of a space underground. Marsupial moles don't create any molehills. They never push up a molehill. They just keep on burrowing through the ground all the time. When it comes to the golden mole that lives at the edge of the Namib, there's two species of them, one in Namakwaland and one in Namibia. Those ones just swim on the surface of dunes. And I suspect that they come out and crawl on the surface a lot at night. But if you spook them, they'll just shallowly burrow into the very loose surface sand, much in the same way as some lizards do. And so again, they certainly are capable of swimming through sand, but they don't do what the marsupial moles do, which is basically to just to churn their way through sand like a kind of a boring machine.
Yeah.
Without any attempt to reuse the space that they've created.
Okay, and do you think the golden moles are using their ability to hear well to track down insects and other soil fauna that fall into their tunnels, and so it's part of their strategy for feeding? Whereas the marsupial mole isn't after insects in the same way. It has a totally different strategy, I assume.
I've never thought about that before, Anthony, but off the top of my head, I think it's probably more to do with predation risk than with food. That would be my rough guess. Because golden moles, perhaps even including the Namib species, are under a much more intense predation regime than is the case for marsupial moles. In fact, marsupial moles are living in a region of the world, West Central Australia, that is so poor in indigenous predators that it might as well be on an oceanic island. And so I suspect that the main reason why marsupial moles have lost their sense of hearing as well as their sense of sight, because I think they're actually completely blind, is that they just have much of a predation risk. That doesn't mean that they expose themselves on the surface, but it's that given the poverty of predators in their environment and the fact that they're underground, I think predation is the least of their worries.
So how do the golden moles forage versus marsupial moles? Are their diets similar, and how do they find their prey animals, or perhaps there's some plant matter being eaten, or is it purely insects and other fauna?
I think it is mainly invertebrates, and I'm not sure whether anybody has studied this in enough detail to make that comparison convincingly. But my general impression about golden moles, apart from those namib desert species, is that they rely more on organic matter, organic topsoils, and they burrow fairly shallowly under the organic topsoil layer, and they eat various invertebrates, including earthworms, and they're dependent on that sort of organic aspect of the soil. Whereas with marsupial moles, you're dealing with an environment that has virtually no organic matter, and the diet of marsupial moles is poorly known, but they do eat the brood of ants, for example, and I suspect what they do is they tunnel from one ant colony to another, the ant colony having quite extensive subterranean chambers filled with brood. And I think this is a complete suspicion, just a complete wild guess. I think they're also targeting the so-called honeypot ants,
Right.
ants that have a special caste that estivates by means of quite ridiculously large collections of sugary liquid that is stored in the abdomens of a certain caste within the colony. So that's quite a lucrative energy source if you can predate those kinds of ants. And there's 2 species at least of these honeypot ants in different genera in their environment. So nobody has documented this. It's just a complete thumbsuck on my part, but I just have a sneaking suspicion. In fact, I'd go as far as to make a prediction. I would say that I predict that within 20 years, it will be discovered in the field that the marsupial moles, Notorictes typhlops and Notorictes caurinus, are regular predators of honeypot ants. I'm making that prediction just out of the blue, and let's see how right I am.
Okay, great. I hope that inspires some researchers to act on it. You think it's likely because it's a bit strange how these animals are so powerful in a nutrient desert. We need to answer the question: where do they get their energy from to swim through the sand? That's why you've gone towards honeypot ants as a theory. Is that right?
Well, that's correct. And to understand that energetic question, one first has to disentangle locomotory energy from reproductive and growth energy. In other words, with most animals in the world, if they have a rapid metabolism, then they're active locomotorily, and they're also rapid in how they grow and reproduce. So, for example, in domestic animals, they have a high body temperature, which indicates rapid metabolism, and they have a furious rate of growth and reproduction, and they're locomotorily active. So that's what you expect. Now, in the marsupial mole, it definitely has a slow metabolism, perhaps slower even than most marsupials. Marsupials in general have slow metabolisms and relatively low body temperatures, and they certainly reproduce slowly relative to comparable eutherian mammals. And we can accept that that's true for marsupial moles as well. But what's incongruous with that is that marsupial moles are by far the most energetic burrowers among insectivorous subterranean mammals, because they don't attempt either to find such loose sand that they can kind of just swim at the surface in the way that the namib golden moles do, nor do they do what the typical moles, the talpidae, do in the northern hemisphere, which is to create a permanent, clean, nice underground tunnel system along which they just commute periodically, snapping up the earthworms that have fallen into this as if into a pitfall trap. So although the northern typical moles, talpidae, do burrow and are very much specialized for burrowing, once they've created a burrow system, it's easy peasy. You just keep beetling along it and just snarf up whatever falls into it. So it's a relatively, it's certainly an energetic life, but it's not the same kind of life as you see in marsupial moles, who basically tunnel actively through every centimeter of travel that they ever perform from birth to death, as far as we know.
What depth are they doing this tunneling? The golden mole in my garden here leaves a tunnel system often close to the surface, so you can see the grass is raised where the mole's been tunneling. Is it the same with the marsupial mole? They tend to stick near the surface?
As far as I know, there's a variety of depths, but it includes greater depths than you would find with a golden mole. So with a
Okay.
golden mole, the general pattern is what I call a runnel, and a runnel is
Yeah.
not it's not a mole hill, but it's a kind of a linear displacement where you can see that
Yeah.
the soil surface is cracked as the animal has tunneled and created some kind of persistent space just a few centimeters below the surface.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't work in the habitat of marsupial moles because they're in a sort of desert sandy area. But as far as I know, they sometimes dig quite deeply and for long distances at quite a great depth. So they really are boring. You know, they go beyond subterranean into a kind of a borer
Yeah.
zone, which hasn't been well named, but you can think of them as boring animals.
Yeah.
But you've got to bear in mind that all of these things are somewhat speculative because this animal is so remote and so scarce
Right.
that despite its incredible interest to zoologists, there's not much information. People are doing their best to work on it, but it's really not easy to do field studies on marsupial moles.
One of the first pictures that pops up when you Google this animal, just type in marsupial mole, is a picture of it feeding on a lizard. And I suppose they are opportunistic feeders then. They'll eat and brood where they can encounter it, but there's quite a range of food size here, fairly large lizard versus ant brood.
Yes, well, that spectacularly well photographed picture of it eating a lizard was taken decades ago and has stood the test of time because it is such a good portrayal, but it's completely captive. That photographer had them in an enclosure.
Oh.
And he set that photo up. That's far from being a photo taken in the wild. Now, that doesn't mean to deny that they can eat a gecko. Yes, they can eat a gecko. But it doesn't really tell you anything about their staple diet. Their staple diet is still largely mysterious. We still await field studies to reveal that.
Ah, okay. And this puzzle that I mentioned at the outset of its distribution, it's in a very localized area in Australia, this nutrient desert. Why do you think it isn't able to occur elsewhere in Australia? I suppose that's the million-dollar question.
That is indeed the million-dollar question, because there's something remarkably perverse about the biogeography of marsupial moles. They are restricted to precisely that part of Australia that everything else that's relevant to this discussion does not penetrate. So, for example, if you take the most common kangaroo of the semi-arid Central Australian plains, the red kangaroo, which is also the largest mammal indigenous to Australia, that creature does not penetrate the zone to which the marsupial moles are restricted. So we're talking about a plain of sand so nutrient poor that despite the fact that it's well vegetated with hummock grasses and various shrubs and trees, most of the larger mammals and birds of Australia cannot hack it. They just can't make it there. There's just not enough to eat. Not because it's bare. It's called desert, but it's not bare. It's a very misleading term in the Australian context to call a place a desert, because the deserts in Australia are, by and large, well vegetated, almost luxuriant savannas, by comparison with, for example, many other parts of the world with a similar climate, similar rainfall. It's not the lack of vegetation that's a problem. It is that the vegetation is so nutrient poor that the food chains are all rudimentary. So if you take emu, for example, as well, emus are widespread across Australia, but they hardly get into this broad north-south band to which the marsupial moles are restricted. And so what's peculiar about marsupial moles is they've not only coped with the kind of nutrient poverty and fire proneness that many Australian mammals and birds have learned to adapt to, but they are restricted to precisely the worst places in Australia to live. Not in terms of being arid and bare, because it's semi-arid and well vegetated, but because it's so astonishingly nutrient poor, particularly in phosphorus and zinc, that even the normal outback animals, like the red kangaroo and the emu, just cannot hack it. You can drive for miles through that country without seeing a kangaroo. And that's not because humans have changed the landscape. There's no farming there. There's nothing going on there. It's more or less the way it was when Europeans arrived centuries ago. It has been left pristine precisely because to this day nobody has found any way to do anything with it. It's just too nutrient poor. In fact, the main anthropogenic alteration there is the introduction of the feral camel, which does quite well counterintuitively in that country. But apart from that, it's pretty pristine. It's one of the biggest areas of still wild land in the world. And it's boring from the point of view of a large animal zoologist because you see nothing there. You just see vegetation and a few insects and plenty of lizards, wonderful diversity of lizards, but they're really quite small fry.
Yeah.
And so in that kind of negative environment that excludes even the Australian adapted larger animals, that is precisely where marsupial moles are restricted.
Right. Is the solution to this puzzle perhaps not in the concept of nature abhors a vacuum, and the animals, the insects and perhaps lizards that the marsupial mole is eating in its habitat are eaten by other animals outside of the habitat. So it just gets this marsupial mole can't move outside of that desert because when it does, it's just got too many competitors for its diet.
Well, that's a very interesting framing. It deserves to be well thought through. But my immediate problem with it is that although biology is full of trade-offs, this is a pretty heavy trade-off. What we're saying is that in order to snarf up those resources that other predators are not in a position to snarf up, the marsupial mole has been willing to adopt an extreme sport lifestyle in which it becomes this tunnel boring animal. You see, if you were to sort of put a gun to my head and say, look, there's a creature out there that's restricted to this so-called empty quarter, this infertile, well-vegetated, semi-arid zone in Australia where nothing else can really hack it in terms of large animals. Can you tell me what kind of animal it would be? I'd say it would be a generalist. I would say it would be some kind of, it would have sparse populations, but it would be a fairly nondescript animal that is a jack of all trades. It would be some small animal that looks somewhere intermediate between a rodent and an insectivore, and does a bit of burrowing and a bit of climbing and a bit of walking. And I would say that's what you'd want in that kind of environment where there's very little of anything, but enough to make a living on if you're sparse and you have a slow metabolism and growth and you're a generalist. But that's completely contradicted by marsupial moles because they are perhaps the most specialized of all marsupials in a sense. It's a hard thing to claim because you have to define your terms, but they are extremely peculiar. And they are, as I said, the supermole. They are the most molish moles on Earth. They are the supermole. They're so much more molish than any other moles on Earth that they're in a kind of a different category that doesn't have a name.
Yeah.
You can call them supermoles, So what doesn't sit easily with me is the incongruence between that kind of ridiculous specialization, as it were, and the fact that it's happened precisely in an environment where nothing else can really make a living in terms of mammals and birds.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful puzzle. Is there any specialization happening in the nutrient deserts of the oceans that we can think of to try and figure out how nutrient deficiency can trigger super specializations?
Well, I think that is, again, a framing that is well worth looking into. And I wouldn't be surprised if nobody has approached the nutrient deserts of the oceans with that framing in mind. So the question would be, in an oceanic nutrient desert, most famously the North Pacific, do you find any creature that is one of the few creatures in that category of creatures that occurs there and is also super specialized in a counterintuitive way? That may be true. I just I have no idea at this point.
Well, I think this puzzle will probably continue for decades, and most enjoyable thinking about it. Thanks, Anthony. Perhaps there'll be scope as we dig into the nutrient deserts, other nutrient deserts, whether oceanic or terrestrial, in the weeks ahead, to have another podcast on this topic, and look forward to exploring it further with you.
Yes, indeed. And to listeners, please like, subscribe, and share. And we look forward to our next item here on Exploring the BioEdge. And until then, over and out from us.
Cheers.